This is the second in a series of programs I'm doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, religion, and science have said about it. Why study human nature? Well, so many of the great thinkers over the centuries have claimed that in order to live a satisfying life, it's very important that one understand oneself, one's nature. And in order to understand one's nature, it's very important to understand human nature. Indeed, perhaps the most famous maxim to have come out of ancient Greece is the following: know thyself. Those words, indeed, were inscribed on the wall of a very famous temple in ancient Greece. And so many of the famous thinkers, in one way or another, have claimed that understanding oneself and others is more important than understanding academic subjects such as science or math. First, a brief review of some of the points I made in my first segment on human nature. I pointed out last week that Sigmund Freud and so many other thinkers have claimed that if we come to a greater understanding of ourselves and other people, that could well result in less anxiety in daily living, less mental and emotional anguish. The question I raised last week and began to answer in last week's segment was the following: which characteristics seem to be common among human beings? And I'm talking about mental, emotional traits of human beings. In other words, which traits, emotional, mental, seem to be typical among most, if not all, human beings? And in answering that question, I started with a quotation from Professor Joseph Campbell, who claimed that human beings, by nature, are desirous and fearful. Here are Professor Campbell's own words: desire and fear, these are the two emotions by which all life in the universe is governed. Aristotle talked about desires. Aristotle said that our desires tend to be insatiable. And among the examples he gave concerns our desire for pleasure. Aristotle claimed that we are so anxious for pleasure, we can never get enough of it. And what are some of the desires common to human beings, besides the desire for pleasure? Well, I think it's fair to say many human beings have a desire for possessions, expensive possessions, status, power, new experiences, emotional security, economic security, and many religious people desire salvation. On the subject of fear and fearfulness being a characteristic of human nature, Robert Audrey, in his very famous book entitled African Genesis, a book in which he compares human animals to non-human animals, says the following, and I'm quoting him: "The world of the animal, both human and non-human, is a world full of fear." And psychiatrist Carl Jung put it this way. Jung alluded to, and I'm quoting him, "the god of terror who dwells in the human soul." And what are some of the fears that tend to be pretty universal among human beings? Well, the fear of death, fear of failure, fear of random illness and disaster, financial disaster, for example, fear that we won't get our pleasure, fear of other people, fear that we are frittering away our time in meaningless and hectic activity. In addition to human beings being desirous and fearful, what might be some other characteristics of human nature? Well, so many of the great thinkers have claimed that we are very complicated creatures. Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist, talked a lot about this in one way or another in his novels and other writings. Tolstoy said that it's not uncommon that people, in describing other people, attribute some leading characteristic to them. For example, Tolstoy said it's not unusual that people, in describing other people, might say something like the following: he or she is very kind, or unkind, wise, foolish, energetic, lazy. Tolstoy says this is wrong. This is not an accurate, this is not a valid way of describing people. Here are Tolstoy's own words. We may say of a person that he is more frequently kind than cruel, wise than foolish, energetic than lazy, or vice versa, but it could never be said, but it could never be true to say of one man that he is wicked or foolish. Why so? Again, Tolstoy's own words. Every man bears within himself the germs of every human trait, displaying all in turn. Aristotle, commenting on the same subject about how complicated we tend to be, said this: there is a foolish corner in the mind of the wisest man. And Socrates commented that there is much imbalance in all people. Schopenhauer put it this way. He said, every genius is in some way stupid. And Howard Gardner, a professor of education and psychology at Harvard, has talked about the idea of multiple intelligences, the idea that there are many forms of intelligence. And Gardner points out, for example, that a man may be very intelligent in science and may become a leading scientist. However, that does not mean that he has the kind of intelligence to be successful at marriage or the kind of intelligence to engage in wholesome child rearing. In other words, an intelligence for science does not guarantee intelligences in other areas. Again, another indication as to how complicated we are. Blaise Pascal, very famous mathematician and devout Roman Catholic, pointed out how morally complicated we are. Pascal said the following, and I'm quoting him: there are two natures in us, the one good, the other bad. Jesus, in commenting on our dark side, said the following: let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And psychiatrist Carl Jung talked about the contradictions in human nature. Jung said the following: the self is a union of opposites. The individual is confronted with the abysmal contradictions of human nature. For in the self, good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins. In the self, good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins. And the founding father, Alexander Hamilton, in talking about human nature and government, said this: if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Yes, human beings are good, human beings are bad. How good? How bad? Well, there is disagreement. Nobel Prize winner Albert Camus has one of his characters, in a book entitled The Plague, say the following: man is more good than bad. But Henry Adams, very famous 19th century professor at Harvard, and the author of a very famous autobiography entitled The Education of Henry Adams, was not quite so optimistic. Adams said that average human nature is very coarse. Average human nature is very coarse. And he ended his autobiography with the hope that someday human nature would be such that sensitive people could live in this world without shuddering. Socrates, in talking about the moral complexity of human beings, said this, and I'm quoting Socrates: The very good and the very bad are few. Most are betwixt and between. Famous writer Henry Fielding, in his classic novel entitled Tom Jones, talks about how to judge the morality of human nature. Fielding claimed that a common error people make in judging human nature is that they judge the character of humankind by the worst and basest of human beings. Fielding claimed that rather we should judge what is characteristic of a species by what is found among the best individuals of that species. For example, and these are examples I'm providing, should we judge human nature by the slave owners in 19th century America, by the worst of the slave owners, those who mutilated, even raped their slaves? Or should we judge human nature by the abolitionists, the people who worked very hard, very diligently to abolish slavery? And indeed, many of these people, especially in the South, jeopardized their own lives. Indeed, some abolitionists were killed. Imagine someone being murdered for wanting to see slavery abolished. Also, if one talks about Nazi Germany, are we to judge human nature by the cruel Nazis, those who were responsible for the Holocaust, killing 6 million Jews? Or should we judge human nature on the basis of those German non-Jews who tried to protect Jews, often putting their own lives in danger? Should we judge human nature on the basis of corrupt politicians and businessmen in America and elsewhere? Or should we judge human nature by examining whistleblowers and zeroing in on whistleblowers, people who expose corruption in government and business, often at the risk of their own careers, sometimes at the risk of their own lives? Many famous thinkers have commented that we are so complicated that we are often ambivalent about other people and also life. Sigmund Freud zeroed in on ambivalence. In fact, it was one of his favorite topics in talking about human nature. Freud claimed that it is not at all uncommon that people can love and hate the same person. Erik Erikson was a disciple of Freud. He taught psychology at Harvard for many years, and Professor Erikson claimed that ambivalence is present in the most loving human relationships. Henry David Thoreau also commented on this and perhaps provides some illumination. Thoreau said the following, and I'm quoting him: "That which we love is so mixed and entangled with that which we hate in one another." What do you think? Are Freud, Erikson, and Thoreau painting too gloomy a picture of us, or are they simply articulating uncomfortable truths about us? Human beings, of course, can be ambivalent not only towards each other, but towards life itself. Writer Alan Watts, among others, has commented on this subject. Watts said this: "We love life and hate life at the same time." And Houston Smith, arguably the most famous professor of comparative religion in America, has put it this way. Professor Smith claims that when things go especially bad for us, everyone, and that's his word, everyone sometimes wonders whether life is worthwhile. Besides being desirous, fearful, complicated, and ambivalent, what other characteristics might we attribute to human nature? Well, so many of the great thinkers claim that we are mask wearers. Schopenhauer, the great German philosopher, put it this way: we all wear a mask and play a role. Mark Twain, in his autobiography, commented, what a wee little part of a person's life are his words and his acts. His real life is led in his head and is known to none but himself. Charles Dickens, in A Tale of Two Cities, penned the following words: every human being is constituted to be that profound secret and mystery to every other human being. Nobel Prize winner Hermann Hesse said this: no man has ever been completely and entirely himself. And Thoreau, in one of his journals, wrote the following: and why should I speak to my friends? For how rarely it is that I am I, and are they than they. Marlon Brando, on the subject of acting, talked about human nature. And Brando said this. He said, acting is among the least mysterious of crafts. He went on to say, most people do it every day. Most people do it, acting, all day long. Jesus also talked about the propensity for mask wearing. Jesus said this: beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. So again, Jesus is talking about some people who give the appearance of being sheep-like, but indeed, in fact, are really more wolf-like. Is Jesus simply talking about con men? Or is Jesus talking about all of us? Is Jesus addressing himself to the sinner and the hypocrite in all of us? Psychiatrist Carl Jung distinguished between our mask, which he called the persona, and our anima, A-N-I-M-A, our anima, which he claimed is our true, unconscious inner self. And here is what Jung said about our persona, and I'm quoting him. The persona is a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression on others, and on the other hand to conceal the true nature of the individual. Again, he said that's in contrast to the anima, our unconscious, true inner self. This reminds me of a comment historian Will Durant made about some historical character. Durant said this: like all of us, he kept his real self a frightened secret from the world. No presentation on human nature could be adequate without Freud and his view of human nature. Let me provide Freud's most comprehensive explanation of his view of human nature, which comes from a book he wrote late in life, a book entitled Civilization and Its Discontents. It's a great book, and again, since he wrote it late in life, it represents his mature thinking. Let me give you Freud's own words on human nature, and I must warn you, this is not pretty. Men are not gentle creatures. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. As a result, their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture and to kill him. Homo homini lupus. That's a Latin word, a Latin phrase, Freud employs. And what does it mean? It means this: man is a wolf to man. Freud believed human beings are innately aggressive. We come out of the womb aggressive. And again, he goes on to say that man is a wolf to man. What evidence does Freud provide to try to validate his comment? Here are his own words. Who, in the face of all of his experience of life and of history, will have the courage to dispute this assertion? Again, this assertion that man is a wolf to man. Freud then goes on to enumerate certain historical events which he believes proves his point. Freud talks about all the atrocities committed by human beings in history, all the invasions, all the conquests, all the wars. And again, he goes on to claim that if one is a diligent student of history, one will come to the inevitable conclusion that human beings are innately aggressive. Indeed, if one was to examine the present state of affairs in the world, if one were to zero in on the genocide presently taking place in the Darfur area of Africa today, or if one were to focus on the ethnic violence in Iraq, Shiites killing Sunnis killing Shiites, some would claim this gives credence to Freud's contentions. Freud claims, or I should say Freud claimed, another way of proving his ideas concerning human nature is to indulge in self-examination. Here are his own words. The existence of this inclination to aggression, which we can detect in ourselves and justly assume to be present in others, is the factor which disturbs our relations with our neighbor and which forces civilization into such a high expenditure of energy. Freud says that as we grow older, we must give up our youthful illusions which we had about other human beings. Again, his own words. The time comes when each of us has to give up as illusions the expectations which in his youth he pinned upon his fellow man, and when he may learn how much difficulty and pain has been added to his life by their ill will. How much difficulty and pain has been added to his life by their ill will. Freud, in a concluding statement, said this: aggressiveness is an indestructible feature of human nature. Aggressiveness is an indestructible feature of human nature. He went on to say, the greatest hindrance to civilization is the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive towards one another. Freud's words are a tough pill to swallow. His words almost take one's breath away. Is Freud alone among the famous thinkers in this very pessimistic view of human nature? By no means. The Dalai Lama, considered a very loving and compassionate person, while he's had many comments about positive traits on human nature, has also said the following, and I'm quoting the Dalai Lama: aggression is an intimate part of ourselves. The most insane aggressiveness continues to live in the depths of us. The most insane aggressiveness continues to live in the depths of us. Scientist Carl Sagan, the late Carl Sagan, whom you might recall had his own show on network television years ago. I think he was the first scientist to have his own show on television. Carl Sagan talked about what he called the reptilian core in human nature. And he described the reptilian core in this way. He said, "It's the kernel of savagery in the brain, left untouched by the process of evolution." And the famous philosopher, Bertrand Russell, perhaps the most famous 20th century philosopher, said that people are more prone to hatred than to friendship. He went on to say that he believed that the environment had something to do with this. Russell was not so certain, not as certain as Freud, that this was innate in human beings. And by the way, in a future program on human nature, I'll be talking about the nature versus nurture controversy and how much of our human nature can be attributed to genes and how much to the environment. In my next program, I will raise the following questions. First, should we be afraid of each other? Secondly, what are some positive characteristics of human nature that often tend to keep the negative ones in check? Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In his masterpiece, Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."